This afternoon's speakers are Geraldo de Souza Diaz, Cauê Alves, and Dr. Nancy Roth. And we're going to begin with Geraldo. Geraldo is from São Paulo. He's an architect, painter, and art theoretician. He studied at the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism at the University of São Paulo, and he completed his doctorate at the Universität der Kunst in Berlin, which was published as the major monograph Mira Schendel do Espiritual a Corporalidade in 2009. As an artist, he has exhibited his works in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Recife, Florianópolis, New York, Boston, London, Rome, Berlin, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and Lisbon. He has taught at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Florianópolis, Marymount College, Tarrytown-on-Hudson in New York, and at the Department of Architecture at São Carlos School of Engineering and the University of São Paulo. He is currently an associate professor at the Escola de Comunicações e Artes da Universidade de São Paulo, where he teaches painting, and a visiting professor at the Instituto de Artes Visuais, Design and Marketing de Lisboa, and of the University of the Arts, Philadelphia in the USA. So, can I invite Cauê, Geraldo to come up?
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, especially Tanya Barson, for the invitation that brought me here today to talk about Mira Schendel. Mira Schendel's work draws a transversal line between European and Brazilian cultures. From a European viewpoint, her work reflects the crisis of modernity and the attempt of overcoming it. In Brazil, on the contrary, a land referred to as non-historical by the philosopher Wilhelm Flusser, the work shows the non-historical fundamentals of the local thinking and its attempt of breaking into history. I will briefly point out some of Schendel's biographical data, present a short overview of her comprehensive art production, and will delay a little longer on a special event, her exhibition in London in 1966. Mira Dub was born in Zurich in 1919 to Jewish Bohemian father and an Italian mother, also from an old Jewish family, although converted to Christianity. 2 years after her birth, the parents divorced, and her mother alone raised her in northern Italy. During the Second World War, she experienced a series of discrimination and had to flee through Eastern Europe. In 1949, she immigrated to Brazil with her first husband, Josip Hargesheimer, the Croatian, living for some years in Porto Alegre, in the south, and in 1953 alone, she moved to São Paulo, where she met Knut Schendel and married him later. She took back painting, which she had experimented in her youth, and in parallel continued as autodidactic, uninterrupted education in philosophy. Focus of her preoccupations was the division of the human nature in body and soul, preferring authors who took a clear anti-Cartesian position and tried to overcome this dualism. Her first paintings show frontal heads, figures, and small still lifes with flat objects. Soon, she would abandon the human figure in the painting that showed just cups, bottles, bowls, and tools in an atmosphere of hieratic silence that stresses the barrenness of the objects. Her first exhibitions occurred in a period in which Brazil experimented an extraordinary economic impulse and searched in the renovation of the art its expression. The role of the visual arts, mainly the geometric abstract, was interpreted as one of the factors that bring progress. Several artists, Schendel among them, started to follow the streams of abstract art shown in the São Paulo Bienal from 1951 on. Mira created geometric paintings which, however, due to the astonishing linear divisions and for the thick and matte material, pictorial mass, differ radically from Brazilian concrete art and remain closer to Milanese painters such as Ennio Morlotti, Renato Biroli, Alberto Burri. In Mira Schendel's monochromatic paintings, predominates an objectless emptiness within which sparkle just visual accidents, an only line, an isolated tracing. The empty space of these pictures cannot be understood as a space of negativity, but as expression of chaotic, informal, and why not to say cosmic amplitude. Once the space no longer shows recognizable objects, it seems to open itself for the representation of the divine. Dispersed, linear marks crystallize as writing, as irregular fragments. Impulses of a calligraphic ductus that suggests rhythm and organization. With the writing, Schendel would leave painting behind her and kept working on rice paper, printed through a process similar to that of monotype. The white of the rice paper, even more indefinite than the density of painting materials, became an ideal field organized by lines, stains, sparkles of everyday life. Among Schendel's reading, Jan Gebser's theories on transparency will play a central role. The contact with the Swiss psychologist and with his main work, Ursprung und Gegenwart, provided support to her experiments with transparency. Transparency enters her work to provide the emptiness of a limited world with the amplitude of an open world, and to flex rigid relations. The consideration of the time softened the space, freed it, making it to flow. The abstract space turned into a concrete space-time continuum within which she would try to express the inexpressible. By doing so, she would line up with the tradition of classic modernism, whose esoteric aspects had been repressed in the European post-war art critic, mainly in its attempt to unite science and mystics. In the decades of 1950s and 1960s, Schendel's circle of friends included renowned intellectuals of São Paulo, such as the physicist Mário Schemberg, Isabel Whiteleg has already talked about, the concrete poet Haroldo de Campos, and the psychiatrist and poet Theon Hispanudis. During several years, a relatively stable friendship united her to Wilhelm Flusser. This philosopher, also of Czech Jewish origins, which lived in Brazil between 1939 and 1972, nurtured a group of discussions in his house that was frequently visited by the artist. Flusser stated that he profited from the contacts with Mira Schendel by receiving stimuli for his writings. That's Flusser. Equally meaningful were her dialogues with liberal monks of the Dominican congregation in São Paulo. With them, she could discuss freely her religious concepts and ideas. The divine was for her not a theme limited to the Sunday Mass or the Sabbaths in the synagogue, but the possibility of having a general understanding of the life relations and to interpret them through her art. She did not incorporate it to the work either idealistically or in symbolic figurations, but through emancipated and non-figurative forms, colors, letters, phrases, fragments. In 1965, Schendel, with the same rice paper of the monotypes, created the Droginis, little drugs. The sheets of the paper were initially rolled, twisted, and interwoven as if in a lacing work, and finally provided with knots which united the threads of this network in irregular spacing. Curiously, in the genesis of this object, the thought exchange between Mira Schendel and Guy Brett that she had just met played a very important role. I quote a letter from Mira Schendel. I started a new work, perhaps more important for myself than any former one, sculpture. In the same rice paper of the drawings, something technically primary and very easy. From an Occidental point of view, these sculptures, this senseless name, might be seen under the perspective of a phenomenology of being, having. From an Oriental point of view, well, they are related to Zen. Whoever would buy one would have to keep it in a box, proportionated to the money spent, to protect it from moisture, flies, air. Something like keeping David Medalla's phone. David Medalla is here. So who owns it won't let it be. The eternity of the flower and the eternity of the Romanesque basilica, the essence and the duration. In 1966, she came to London to show her works at Signals Gallery. It was her first trip to Europe since her immigration to Brazil in 1949, and lasted from August to November, the trip. The outlet for Brazilian artists to exhibit in Europe occurred until the years 1960s, almost exclusively over Paris. The meaning of London is closely connected to the valorization of pop music and with the related transformation of behavior patterns, what could change the city into a magnet for young people around the world. In the beginning of the decade, 1960s, the Philippine artist David Medalla started to organize experimental exhibitions backed by the art critic Guy Brett and the actor Paul Killer, what originated Signals Gallery. Medalla and Killer met in Paris the Brazilian sculptor Sérgio Camargo and invited him to show his works in the gallery. Camargo's mediation opened the possibility for artists such as Lygia Clark, Elliot Sika, and Mira Schendel. In 1966, Mira exhibited several drawings, monotypes, and a few Droginis in this gallery. It was the largest and most comprehensive exhibition she had in her lifetime. After the indifference in the reception of similar works showed that the Museu of the Arte Moderna in Rio de Janeiro the year before, it probably would have meant for her a lot the large public that filled the second floor of the gallery during the opening, as David Medalla reported to me. Most shown works contained no letters or words, but pure graphic elements, such as a dot or a line. Notwithstanding, an article in the Brazilian press brings a connection between the group Noigandres of Brazilian poets and the British concrete poets Ian Hamilton Finlay, Edwin Morgan, and John Furnivall. Also, her interest in the work of the Benedictine Don Sylvester Uedard and the Irish Jesuit Cyril Barrett was mentioned. A small note in the British press was mostly descriptive, refrained, and at the end, a bit sharp. Now I quote the critic. They are alive with the sheer speed of execution and clearly are drawn at the rate of the normal thought process. There are different series, some suggesting plans of buildings, some clusters of points like ants or people seen from high up. Some are merely scribbled word or two with directional arrows. There seems to be no outcome from these in the form of more serious work. They are the record of an emotional outpouring which for the writer could well have remained private. Signal's newsletter from March 1966 was dedicated to Venezuelan artist Alejandro Otero and contained two small notes on Mira Schendel. The October edition should have been entirely dedicated to her, but the gallery closed down exactly during her exhibition. Dave Medalla comments the crisis that led to the closing of the gallery. I quote, "During all that time, I was having a very big struggle with the owner of the gallery, of the building, because he was an American who supported the American president who was bombing Vietnam. We had an American artist who burned the American flag in the gallery. American writers like William Burroughs were there, and they too were against the Vietnam War. And this man who owned the building sent about 60 men to close the gallery down. Luckily, she had the privilege of having an opening and all that, but suddenly we had to remove the works. Due to the closing down of the gallery, an explanatory article by Guy Brett on Schendel's exhibition could not be published in the Times. However, her works were illustrated with photos and extensively discussed in his book, Kinetic Art, The Language of Movement. Guy Brett had met Mira Schendel in São Paulo the year before her trip to London. Following a recommendation from Sérgio Camargo, he visited Schendel's studio in São Paulo. Among the works exhibited in London in 1966, Brett had a special interest for the Droginis. Guy Brett talks about them. I find those objects fascinating. Of course, they were ephemeral in philosophical terms. That is very important. The fact that they have no value, nobody would want to buy them, they were a kind of joke, but they were a very good joke. I still think they are very important in her work, very prophetic. The work by Benedictine monk and concrete poet Dom Sylvester with art presents many convergence points with Mira Schendel. Most probably, the mediator of their meeting was the Brazilian concrete poet Augusto de Campos, that since the beginning of the 1960s corresponded with him. During her trip in 1966, right after her arrival in Portugal, Mira wrote to the Abbey Picknash in Gloucester because she wanted to meet Don Sylvester in London. His answer, he wanted to go to London to visit her exhibition, reached her, though only after her return to Brazil. What concerned the works, in spite of the closing of the gallery, he could have seen them in the Brazilian embassy. An artist's letter reveals her disappointment with the exhibition. I quote Mira Schendel now. I doubt that you have seen my show at Signals once the gallery closed down during it, and Paul Killer and David disappeared in the occasion. Evidently, I believed, but I did not think, as Max Benzi would say. 8 drawings and 4 Droginas should have been consigned to the Brazilian Embassy, Green Street 21. Mrs. Vera Pacheco Jordão, our cultural attaché, will be able to tell you with many details the bad wolf tale. Other drawings, many, remain with Cyril Barrett, S.J., who too, but very much better than me, occupies himself with Wittgenstein and Cusano and kinetic art. But with this Barrett, I had a kind of misunderstanding concerning questions of faith and trust on the human being, in a moment in which this faith represented for me a psychological violence. At any case, a large number of my drawings remained with him, and I hope he will promote them. During the opening at Signals, Mira met with Huedard's friend, the Irish Jesuit, philosophy historian, and art critic, Cyril Barrett. Notwithstanding their different opinions about some topics, she tried to keep in contact with him. I quote Mira Schendel in a letter to Cyril Barrett. I hope my drawings could set the possibility of dialogue. Through your mediation, they enter the English and European discussion. At the moment, Catholicism touches the possible dialogue. I think, and I believe it, so do you, of the urgent necessity of a broader critical exactitude concerning visual arts as part of a critique on the entire culture. If the problem is legitimate, that is, a problem, then it should be finally possible its correct formulation. Either this, or should we declare it, together with other problems, a pseudo-problem. The problem of language proves to be a central one. Responsibility means to accept art as a fact, that and nothing else. The misunderstanding, now dissipated, had hurt me. I beg you, if possible, to send me either an article or notes on your conferences, your books too, in the case you write them. All this is not for my personal pleasure, but to make them known among friends. Beyond this, I also beg you, in the case you have the time, please write something on my work, a contribution for a large clarity. Every approach to art through sensibility has proven to be insufficient, if not harmful. Therefore, I am glad that you deal with these questions with reason and intuition. End of quote. Cyril Barrett taught aesthetics at the University of Warwick and history of modern philosophy with Wittgenstein as focus at the Theological Institute in Dublin. In 1971 came up his book on op art, which is one of the most complete on the theme. In 1998, when I met him, he taught art history at Oxford University and remembered Mira Schendel's drawings. I quote Cyril Barrett. They were very optical, and that's why they must have appealed to Don Sylvester. They were very high aesthetic, oriental in a way, with the delicacy of oriental lines and certain oriental thoughts. Okay, I go now to describe Don Sylvester Huedard's work. As a modern contemplative poet, Don Sylvester Huedard incorporated the accomplishments of the avant-garde from the Impressionists to John Cage, passing by the Dadaists in the search of an interior path that could bring together monastic transcendentalism and experiments of visual poetry. Through his poems, he aimed at a spiritual consonance with religious poets from Far Eastern cultures, especially with the haiku poets of the Zen Buddhism. In the connecting field of Western scriptorium and Eastern Zen, he saw the possibility of a new ascetics. Huedard became best known for his tracts that could be seen as topological tantric forms. By means of mathematical permutation of letters and figures, sound effects and visual patterns, these poems convey to the reader a somewhat cold but tense interaction present in every contemplation exercise. The title of one of his poems, Sleeping Sideways into God, could explain his creation process, an elliptical dislocation from poetry to religion without missing the formal elements, the non-verbal. Schendel's and Huedard's trajectories are similar in a very relevant aspect. They did not restrain themselves to a certain art genre. Like Schendel, who departed from painting to get to visual poetry with excursions through object production and finally returned to painting, Huedard's border blurs, employing a very dear term created by him for the dissolution of borders between different arts would grant him a special place in the history of British avant-garde. Schendel's admiration for Ouédarde's artwork can be seen in the series she would develop in the 1970s, which she called datiloscritos. Datilografia is the Portuguese word for typing. And also, in one of her cadernos, notebooks, there is a dedication to him. These are Mira's, and that's the MS and then the HS. This work is at the John Rylands Library in Manchester. Mira Schendel's exhibit at Signals also made possible to her to meet the Chinese artist Wan Shi, a gallery assistant at the time. Once Schendel's knowledge of English was not enough for her getting by, he offered himself to help her as interpreter and to keep her company because he could speak Italian. The following biographical data on Wan Shi were friendly sent to me by Guy Brett, who in 1998 was working in a monography on the artist. He just told me that it's already published in 2001. He was born in 1929 in China, South China, studied in a boarding school in the beginning in the mainland and afterwards in Taiwan, where eventually he might have studied art. In the middle of the decade 1950, he founded, with friends, Tang Fan, the first Chinese group to show abstract art. In 1962, the group went to Bologna, where they joined the group Punto, led by Milanese painter Antonio Calderara. Wan Shi's work evolved there to monochromatic abstract easel paintings and geometric wooden reliefs, on top of them tiny dots, a graphic mark, a perforation, or a little disc pasted to the surface, stressed the pure void of the remaining area. After accepting the invitation to show his work at Signals in 1966, he decided to take residence in London and never left England. David Medalla talks on Schendel's interest on Wan Shi's work. Mira and Lee became, it's a quotation, Mira and Lee became very good friends because she had this kind of admiration for Zen culture, Taoism, I Ching. They somehow merged into each other when she was in London, but Lee comes from a more ancient Chinese conception of the world. It's not Taoism, not Confucianism, it's all based on a very strong mystical language, very symbolic too. He did at times very abstract works, which were just a dot or two. Mira was doing just those strokes on rice paper. And the same with Lee. He was doing paintings, mainly black and white, sometimes occasionally using red and gold, with minimal elements of incorporated photographs. Guy Brett had similar opinions. I quote Guy Brett. There was clearly a connection, some affinity between the works, the spirituality, Chinese thought, and Zen. The idea he was working with was the idea of the cosmic point. Simultaneously, there were these discs on which the points are attached with magnets and sometimes other objects. These magnetic discs were letters, with letters and points. You could move them around. End of quotation. Spirituality and Zen philosophy were not the only convergence points between Mira Schendel and Wan Shi. Also, the extreme simplification and economy of elements in the works coincide in the creative process of both artists. In 1968, Wan Shi moved to a rural house in Brampton, north of England. After having it renovated, he founded the LYC Museum, where works by Mira Schendel were exhibited in 1972 and 1973. Now I end this session about London, and I get back to the development of her work. This is another work by Yuhua. The use of plexiglas plates in the end of the decade 1960 meant an apex in Mira Schendel's creative process once they allowed the flowing of rhythmic and metalinguistic thoughts towards the indefinite, towards the chaotic already tried in the bidimensionality, could also be programmatically unfolded also in three-dimensional space. Her participation in the Venice Biennale 1968 gave her the opportunity of her second travel to Europe when she met Jean Gebser in Switzerland. In 1969, the hardening of Brazilian military dictatorship disorganized land's cultural life, reaching some people closely related to Mira Schendel, for example, Mário Schemberg. The artist would then initiate a phase of more intimate works, which stress her silence. Out of this quietness arose an artistic language that could be understood as a private reckoning of a process of self-realization. With the cadernos, that's these two examples here, notebooks, Schendel would experiment this serialization through the impulsive act of perusing pages. The strongly colored series of the mandalas brings us a dance of eternal movement through the rhythmic repetition of its elements, combination of pure and aggressive colors, and only apparently closed and static geometric compositions. More than ever, this art announces extreme possibilities under the caption of work in progress, an autobiography that doesn't convey events, but longings for something not yet realizable, the documentation of the process of individuation as defined by Carl Jung. More and more frequent travels to Europe interrupted her isolation and recreated the contact with intellectuals, mainly from the German language geographic space. Her meetings with the philosopher Hermann Schmitz, he teaches, I don't know if he's still alive, but he teaches at University of Kiel. And the reading of his work, System der Philosophie, were fundamental for the transformation of her artistic ideas, which will mark her last achievements. By means of the temporal wood plates with little inlays of gold, Schendel interpreted Schmidt's ideas concerning corporeity, in German's Leiblichkeit. German has two words to explain this corporeity. Leiblichkeit is only used for superior animals or alive things, and Körper is for any object. And individuation out of the chaotic multiplicity. In pictures mostly monochromatic, shines a small triangle or a golden stripe, as if its sublimed materiality could reach the dimension of a cosmic fragment. Her gesture takes the massiveness of an architectural being in her last series, the Sarrafos, by liberating a wooden stick from the picture plane and through that generation three-dimensionality, disregarding the differences between representation and reality. After her death in 1988, Mira Schendel's oeuvre experimented an increasing recognition within a Brazilian art history. Together with Elliot Sica and Ligia Clark, Brazilian art criticism guided by the motto of pure art, as postulated by the minimalists, and takes over the discourse of artistic autonomy under the strong influence of Clement Greenberg's theories. In the process, however, the spiritual aura of Schendel's work is unconsidered by receiving rationalistic interpretations. Several records, letters, diaries, magnetic tapes testify that Schendel did not have any interest for an autonomous artistic discourse. That's why she tried to establish parallels between her accomplishments and scientific research. She read authors who related theology, psychology, and exact science, and created theoretical interdisciplinary frameworks when these could inspire her forms and strengthen her ideas on art. The tonic of her works could be understood as the experience of an I in the world as a metaphor for the human life that she might have assumed existentially, but always mediated by a divine principle. Her works has been shown out of Brazil at first in several large group exhibitions of Brazilian art, caused by the transformation in the hegemonic art centers that started to search for artistic expressions to exemplify the phenomenon that economical jargon calls globalization. Unfortunately, this reception could not help labeling her work as an exotic product. Even her recent exhibition in 2008 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York did not escape this trend by showing her work falsely connected to the Argentinian artist Leon Ferrari. Schendel's origin was decisive for her unique aesthetic project that contains updated reference to apparently so diverse traditions, namely the Bohemian Judaism with its iconoclasm and language mysticism, and the Roman Catholicism with the sensuality of a visually rich culture. Such a personal project had as main characteristics the self-determination, a constant search for freedom, and the updating and enlarging of a concept of God. We might say that for her, art would only be meaningful in connection with that. Her art and ideas are not tuned with the claims of a nationalist cultural vision, the more multiple, cosmopolitan, anthropophagic it can be, but much better with the predictions of a supranational art which could not consider political barriers in order to convey its emotional messages. Symbolic elements of that art bring the notion of a subject who, out of a formless background, the chaotic multiplicity, makes its presence noticed by means of discrete allusions. Mira Schendel's work possesses an exemplar meaning within, but also far beyond Brazilian artistic and cultural history. Thank you very much for your attention and patience.